On WNIN Lawmakers this week, our guests are Indiana Congressman Dr. Larry Bucshon and Indiana State Representative Ryan Hatfield. We'll also get an update from the Indiana General Assembly. That's coming up next on WNIN. Welcome to WNIN Lawmakers. I'm John Gibson, WNIN News Director and host of WNIN FM's Morning Edition. Our guests this week are U.S. Congressman Dr. Larry Bucshon and Indiana State Representative Ryan Hadfield. We'll speak with Representative Hadfield a little later in the program, but right now we're joined by Representative Larry Bucshon, who represents the 8th Congressional District of Indiana. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Congressman.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, John. Appreciate it.
Well, let's dive into a few questions here. Sure. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that COVID-19 numbers are running pretty high in our area right now.
Yeah.
How do you see us returning to, some semblance of normalcy?
Well, I think most people are thinking the Omicron variant is going to peak sometime in the first couple of weeks of February, and hopefully that will be the case. Mm-hmm. The good news is with Omicron is it has not been as virulent, as dangerous as the previous variants, but also you have more people vaccinated now than we did when Delta came through. So I'm hopeful that this is going to get better as we get into spring. The reality is, though, I recommend people get vaccinated. I'm against government mandates, and I'm glad the Supreme Court overturned the mandate. However, I would encourage, as a physician, for people to still consider getting vaccinated, because what's that shown, John, is that even if you get COVID and you're vaccinated, that you don't get as severe disease, and your risk of being hospitalized or dying from COVID is dramatically improved if you're vaccinated. So I think the higher vaccination numbers, the reality is that people are going to be starting to see a downturn, I think, in the effects of COVID over the next month.
You mentioned vaccinations. I assume you endorse booster shots as well?
I do, and I've been vaccinated and I've gotten the booster. The reality is, though, again, that's a personal choice. I encourage people as a physician to do that, but I understand that there are some people that are skeptical and have made the decision not to get vaccinated, but that's their choice in my view, although I wish they could reconsider.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned the Supreme Court decision against the federal mandate on businesses to require COVID vaccinations. Do you think individual businesses have a right to require vaccinations for their employees, particularly, say, in the medical field?
Well, look, I think if there's personal freedom out there for individuals, I think the private sector also should not have government intervention, and they should be free to make decisions they think will be the best for their business or their hospital. So, again, I'm against the federal government mandating things, but again, in the private sector, they can make their own individual decisions, and they have to live with those. And I think some businesses have made those decisions to require vaccination, and some have not, depending on their situation. So, again, it's the freedom to make the decision in the private sector and not have the government intervene.
As a medical professional yourself, do you feel pretty strongly, though, that, say, medical facilities, hospitals, that kind of thing, would you encourage them to require vaccination?
Well, I think they have for decades, really. If you work at a hospital, you've had to get the flu vaccine every year for decades, so I don't see this as dramatically different. And again, I think the vast majority of healthcare professionals have voluntarily gotten vaccinated. I think the numbers are very low of people who haven't, because again, hospitals and medical facilities have mandated certain vaccinations really for decades, and I don't see this as much different.
Yeah. Recently on the Newsmaker program here, you told the Courier and Press's Tom Langborn that you thought that maybe it's time for Dr. Anthony Fauci to step down. Do you still feel that way, and why?
Yeah, I think so. He's been in the public health system in Washington for many years. and he's done a good job on behalf of the American people for many years. But as it relates to COVID, I think his message has been politicized, and I think he's succumbed to politics. And the reality is that the message coming from Dr. Fauci and on others, including at the CDC, has been inconsistent and many times not accurate. And I think at this point, Dr. Fauci should consider retirement.
You mentioned inconsistency. Does some of that sort of go along, though, with just the way this virus has worked? I mean, unexpected things. I mean, can you not expect the message to have to change sometimes when you've got a virus that's changing?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, John. I think that's true. But also, for example, recently when the CDC came out and said, hey, if you have a positive COVID test, 5 days, of isolation, and then you should be fine and you can go back to work or, get out of the house and not be isolated. And then there was political pressure for them to change that and say, well, what about getting a COVID test after the 5 days to prove that you are negative? And then they waxed and waned on that message. That's inconsistency, and when you get that, the American people don't really know what to do. And so yes, there is some aspect of the fact that this is a new virus. We don't really know still totally how it acts, but you still have to have a consistent message that doesn't change and also is not affected by politics, which that one I just mentioned was, and be consistent so the American people know what they should be doing.
Well, let's move on to the economy. We're all dealing with inflation right now. What are your thoughts on that? What is causing prices to be higher than I think anybody would like to see it, say the grocery store and the gas station?
Sure. Well, a number of things. First of all, COVID has had a dramatic effect on the worldwide supply chain. They shut down manufacturing overseas in Asia, which affects our economy dramatically. That has been there. But I also think that the current administration's policies as it relates to fossil fuels, oil and natural gas, stopping pipelines, preventing permitting, has had an effect on the fuel prices, and that part of the economy has definitely struggled because of high gas prices. So it's really multifactorial. I do think that, threats of tax increases on businesses that have been out there, for example, in the Build Back Better plan, which didn't pass, and that uncertainty that's created there, and also the regulatory climate has gotten tougher. But in fairness, I think the global pandemic has had a dramatic effect on the economy, but I don't think the administration's policies have helped.
Well, obviously, inflation's been a big problem, but at the same time, we are seeing some pretty robust economic growth. How is that happening? It seems like we're seeing sort of both ends here. We're getting the inflation, which we don't like, but also we're seeing growth in the economy and also unemployment pretty low right now. Yeah,
I think the people are getting back to work. As the pandemic has again changed somewhat. We have a higher level of vaccination. We also know more about the virus. Omicron's not quite as dangerous as the Delta. And I think, things are starting to improve. We still have supply chain issues, of course. I also think that, ending some of the extended unemployment that we had that I didn't agree with last year has had a dramatic effect on getting people to go back to work. But it's a multifactorial thing. I think, the American people want to get back to work. They want to get things going. And, I think the economy is going to continue to improve. The unemployment rate in Indiana has been dramatically low for really a long time. And now we're starting to get back to normal, I think, because we know how to deal with the pandemic much better than we did. People are getting vaccinated. People are becoming immune because they've had it. And people know how to protect themselves. So it's a complicated thing, the economy. But I think the American people are getting back to work and getting things going. So I'm happy about that.
Now, as I understand it, you voted against the infrastructure bill in Congress. First of all, I guess, why did you do that? And are there any projects, in that bill coming to our area that you do support?
I think 80% of what was in there I support and have for a long time since I've been in Congress. We need more money for roads, bridges, our airports, rural broadband, for example, traditional infrastructure. But the things I don't support is some of the, the green energy things that are in there for all the money for charging stations for electric vehicles, and a lot of the what I would call things that we're not quite there yet. Not that I don't support going to a carbon-free society, I do, but I think we're getting out ahead of ourselves when we're throwing billions, even trillions of dollars at some of the environmental policies that the political left supports, and ultimately that money is going to be wasted. I think we could do better keeping that money in traditional infrastructure for now and working on innovation and technology advances and then moving along to a more carbon neutral society. And part of their projects that they're putting in place also further impinge on our ability to produce natural gas and oil when we could be the #1 energy producers in the world. So I'd say 80% of what was in there, I think everybody supports. But you just can't support billions and billions of dollars to industries that are really just getting off the ground. I just think that right now that's a big waste of money.
So, as you say, you agree with about 80% of it.
Yeah.
If I remember from my days in school, that would be a low B, I think. Is that not enough to get your vote?
Well, no, it's not, because the actual dollar amounts of the rest of the 20% are in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And so, as a steward of the taxpayer dollar, I don't want to waste anybody's money. And so I think it's unfortunate, honestly, John, that we couldn't get a bipartisan agreement on that 80%. That was on the table. We could have done that. And even though we did get enough votes in the Senate to pass this through, on the House side, there were not that many Republicans who felt like this was the right approach because of the wasted money going really to, I think, the political friends of the Democrats as it relates to the green energy economy. Again, not that I don't support electric vehicles, not that I don't support getting carbon emissions down, because I do. But we just can't get out ahead of ourselves and waste billions and billions of taxpayer dollars when the innovation and technology isn't quite there yet.
You voted against, as you mentioned earlier, the Build Back Better bill. It's currently stalled in the Senate. There is talk of maybe presenting certain chunks of that bill. Are there any parts of it that you see yourself able to support?
Well, I don't know. We'll see what they come up with. I think the Build Back Better bill is actually just a federal intrusion into the American people's lives, all the way from when you're a little kid all the way to the end of your life. I mean, they wanted to expand government entitlement programs and things that we can't afford. They want to work towards nationalizing health care by expanding subsidies for Obamacare to everyone, regardless of income. I mean, there's just so many things in there that the problems that they're trying to address are real, but it's not the federal government's role to do these things. And so it would have created really and more programs that would make us all dependent in some way on the federal government, and that's just not the right approach in the United States.
Obviously, there's a lot of partisanship. We've all heard about the various gridlock. But are there some bills coming through Congress that you can tell us about that perhaps both sides of the aisle support? Are there some measures you'd like to point out?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful that we can get the government funded this year. I think we're real close. Right now we're funding the government based on what are called continuing resolutions, which basically continues the funding as is from last year. I'm very optimistic we'll come to an agreement on how to fund the federal government for the rest of this fiscal year going forward. I personally have legislation on laboratory testing called the VALID Act, and I'm hopeful we can get that across the finish line. That's very important in my view, and it's bipartisan. Because right now the laboratory testing, for example, genetic diseases, is kind of the Wild West, and we want to make sure we have accurate tests that are clinically relevant. So I'm working on that. That's going to be a big deal.
So you're talking about health labs?
Yeah, health labs, right? Okay. And testing. Say, for example, they draw your blood and do genetic tests on you. Is that test accurate? And we've shown that a lot of them are not. There was just an article in the New York Times talking about prenatal testing, for example, pregnant women, and diagnosing genetic diseases in their unborn child that turn out to not be true when they actually test the amniotic fluid, for example, and find out that these blood tests are not accurate. So that's what I'm working on. But I think we're going to see not much happen over the course of this year, honestly, in Congress. which is disappointing because it's an election year.
Right.
And we're going to have a hard time finding common ground. But I do think we can fund the government and do other things like the Valid Act, which is bipartisan, and some other things like that.
You mentioned it is an election year, and you announced in November that you are seeking a 6th term in Congress.
Yeah, 7th.
It will be a 7th now?
It'll be 7th,
I've lost count, sorry.
Yeah.
Can you tell us, why did you decide to run again?
Well, because I think I can still be effective on behalf of the 8th District. I mean, I've been a solid proponent of freedom and liberty and the private sector and creating jobs and keeping people economically in good shape. I also am one of the people in Washington working hard to get health care costs down, and I have an area of expertise there. So I still think that I have a lot to offer the people of the 8th District. And, you know, I'm honored and privileged to do this job on their behalf, and I hope that they'll support me come November. But I still think there's some things left undone that I'd like to try to address in Congress.
All right, I think we are just about out of time. Congressman Bucshon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, John. Appreciate it. Anytime.
Thank you. Safe travels, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Up next is Indiana State Representative Ryan Hatfield. But first, we'll get a brief update about this week at the General Assembly from Indiana Public Broadcasting's Brandon Smith.
Supporters of a House-approved measure that bans trans girls from girls' high school sports say it preserves fairness in competition. But the measure receives significant pushback from LGBTQ Hoosiers and advocacy groups, parents, and medical experts. Opponents of the bill also note that the Indiana High School Athletic Association already has a process to handle gender identity and athletic participation. An elections bill on the House floor says that Hoosiers applying for an absentee mail-in ballot must attest that they won't be available not just on Election Day, but any time in the 28 days before the election when early in-person voting is available. And House lawmakers made changes to a school curriculum bill that aim to address concerns about teachers' workloads, parents' authority over curriculum, and limits to classroom conversations about race. Still, some Republicans joined every Democrat to vote against the measure, and it faces an uncertain future in the Senate. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Brandon Smith at the State House.
Joining us now is Indiana State Representative Ryan Hatfield. He represents Indiana's 77th District, which includes a large portion of Evansville. Thank you for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
All right. Well, let's start with a fact that I don't have to tell you, and that is that Republicans have a supermajority in the legislature. As a Democrat, what are your main goals? What do you hope to get done as a member of the minority party in the Indiana General Assembly?
Sure. Well, you know, it's tough, but, you know, when I arrived in Indianapolis after my election in 2016, you go kind of with big ideas and hopes to pass legislation. Then, you know, through time, you learn that you can be more effective working with Republicans and making sure that their bills are doing some of the things that we want them to do, adding language that helps Evansville. So my focus has been, how do I work with the majority party's bills to deliver results really back home for Evansville?
Are you able to find much across the aisle cooperation?
You know, what I've found is if you're willing to pass legislation that doesn't have your name on it, that people don't necessarily remember you for, but if you're willing to work on somebody else's legislation, you absolutely can get some things done.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about education. The Indiana House recently approved a school curriculum bill, which would require so-called qualified schools to post their educational activities and such online. I believe curriculum plans and such. It has been scaled back a bit, but you voted against it. Can you tell us why you objected to that?
You know, we're at a time when we're hearing from teachers that they're overworked and underpaid. And last year we came in and we did some things to try to get them a pay increase. Not enough, but a pay increase. But they're still overworked, and the burdens on them are greater than ever before. And this bill proposes that not only do they have to put all their lesson plans online, but if the conversation changes or a teacher sees an opportunity to teach a new teaching point during the day, they have to run to the online portal, change the curriculum, tell parents what happened and how it changed and it's burdensome and it is unnecessary. And we heard from teachers all over the state that it's just simply not workable.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's also talk about COVID-19. Obviously, you and I both walked in here. We've got our masks with us. We've seen very high COVID numbers in recent weeks here in Indiana and across the country. How do you feel Indiana and the region has been doing in terms of testing and getting people vaccinated and boosted?
Well, let me first say that I want to commend the governor on telling Hoosiers the truth. The governor's done an outstanding job at trying to get the information out there, encouraging vaccinations, encouraging masks. But quite frankly, he deals with a General Assembly, Republicans in the House and the Senate, who fight him at every turn, who oppose him at every turn, who have filed bill after bill to scale back his ability to tell Hoosiers the truth. And so Indiana really suffers for it. We're seeing hospital beds that are maxed out. We're seeing doctors and nurses report that they've never been so overworked and exhausted, and we're seeing our numbers skyrocket. What I will tell you from our own data from Deaconess here in town is that if you are vaccinated and if you stay cautious and wear a mask, you are less likely to end up in the hospital, less likely to end up seriously sick, and less likely to die. The folks that are getting really sick and the folks that are dying are the unvaccinated. And so I would encourage all to get vaccinated when they're able.
Yes, and booster shots as well.
And booster shots as well.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit about the economy. We're dealing with inflation. We're also, though, seeing some low unemployment rates. What are your thoughts on these trends? I'm guessing you appreciate the statewide unemployment rates being low, but obviously we're all dealing with inflation.
Well, I got to tell you, the President Biden has done such a great job at getting states what we need to do the necessary investments. And so what we've seen, 3 years ago, I was here commending President Trump on about a 2.93% growth under the Trump economy. Yesterday, we found out that the Biden economy is near 6%. It's the largest growth in decades, dating back to 1984. Indiana has benefited from what we've done at the federal level to make sure states have and make sure that they get the investments they need. It's incumbent on us now to make sure that we invest those dollars. What I'm seeing in the General Assembly, what I fear is that we are going to have a tax credit where most families will get about $100, but it'll spend our money down at the state level to the point where we can't make the big investments that some of the other states are making to make sure our quality of life is here. Why is that important? Well, places like the Wellborn Foundation here in town did a white paper that studied what are making millennials move to states. It's quality of life. It's the states that are investing those dollars back into the state to make sure that it's a fun and good and a neat place to live. So we need to do that here in the state of Indiana. I'm hoping that we'll take those rescue dollars, take the Biden growth that we're seeing throughout the state and invest it back into our communities. That's what's going to push our economy forward.
Is there anything at the state level that can be done to help, say, get gas prices and grocery prices down?
We certainly work with the states around us to make sure that we are competitive, and we have done a few things at the state level to make sure that we are getting products in at a rate that we need them, and so that we don't see unusually high prices. And so, yeah, there are some things we can do. A lot of it's controlled by the federal government and even beyond those borders. But the things that we can do as a state are to make those investments and then to make sure that we're not causing any of the supply chain issues that we've seen elsewhere. And so we're doing some of those things.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about House Bill 1215. Speaking of economics and jobs, it would establish a work-sharing unemployment program. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Sure. I have filed this bill for the last 5 years, I think, and it's something where unions and President Biden and President Trump and myself and the chamber, we all agree on it. So you're seeing parties that don't normally agree come in and say work-share is really the way to go. Work-share is a program that allows a company to apply to a state during economic downturns that says, hey, we're in an economic downturn, but we've invested in these workers, we've trained them, they're good people, we want them to stay, we don't want to have to let them go, but we need to reduce their hours because we're in an economic downturn. It allows those employees to continue to keep those jobs, work a reduced amount of hours, but also receive an unemployment benefit at a pro rata share so that we are ensuring that they have what they need through those economic downturns, but keeping them in those jobs that they've been trained and they do so well. Again, President Trump rewarded states during the pandemic that had these work share programs. Indiana missed out on millions of dollars because we weren't one of them. I hope that my colleagues will join me and the chamber and the labor unions in supporting this effort.
Back to education for a moment. You also have authored a bill, House Bill 1216, that would eliminate textbook fees. This is something else I believe you've championed for a while.
That's right. We are one of now just 6 states in the country that charge for textbooks that are required in school. No 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10-year-old should have to be worried about whether mom or dad can afford the bill for the textbook that is required in their 3rd or 4th grade class, or whether they paid the textbook fee from the last year and so they can't get the textbook this year, when these are materials that are required for them to build on the building blocks of their education. And so we're one of 6 states that continue to charge these fees. It's one more way to help middle class families in Indiana, and I hope that we'll join the rest of the country in waiving these fees.
Obviously, it's faced opposition. Why are some of your colleagues opposed to that idea? You know,
it's been an interesting struggle. The House Republicans have continued to demand that we be one of 6 states that keep high textbook prices and rental fees, but we don't require it among every school in the state of Indiana. Some charters are able to waive those fees, but our traditional public school families continue to pay them. So it's been unfortunate. I hope that we'll get it done at some point. It will not be this year, but I'm hopeful maybe next year in the budget year.
So again, this year looking like it won't happen this time.
I'm skeptical that it'll happen this year.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm afraid our time is just about run out. Representative Hatfield, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thanks again for being with us this week. Representative Bucshon, we'd like to thank him. He was on the program earlier. Next week, our scheduled guest is Indiana State Senator Jim Toms. I'm John Gibson of WNIN FM. Thanks for joining us for WNIN Lawmakers.